That's it. That's how you defend yourselves. The question hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. Commander Drax of the Galvan Guard, a towering figure with 4 arms and the muscular build of a warrior bred for battle, couldn't hide his surprise. He and the other alien soldiers exchanged puzzled glances, their numerous eyes blinking in confusion. They had all gathered for what they assumed would be a humbling experience, learning combat techniques from a Deathworlder, the galaxy's most feared species. Yet, what they had witnessed so far seemed underwhelming. Across the room, Sergeant Harris stood with his hands casually tucked into his standard-issue combat pants. His posture relaxed, a sharp contrast to the tense Galvans who stood in formation awaiting further instruction. Harris, a human from Earth, was tall and lean, his movements fluid but controlled. He had the appearance of someone who didn't need to prove himself, which only added to the confusion of the aliens watching him. Drax finally spoke again, breaking the silence. You just held his wrist and that's enough to stop an attack? Harris smiled slightly, shaking his head. Not just his wrist, the pressure on certain nerves, coupled with leverage. Here, let me demonstrate again. He beckoned to one of the alien soldiers, a hulking figure nearly twice Harris' size, to come forward. Reluctantly, the Galvan approached, eyeing the human with uncertainty. Okay. Pretend to grab me, Harris instructed. The Galvan hesitated for a moment before reaching out with a large clawed hand. Harris moved swiftly, his hand locking onto the alien's wrist, and in a flash, the Galvan was on the ground, groaning as Harris applied a subtle twist to his arm. That's it, Harris said, releasing the alien, who quickly scrambled to his feet. Basic self-defense. A murmur rippled through the group. They had expected something more dramatic. Punches, energy weapons, or perhaps a display of the rumored human savagery that had given Earth its notorious reputation. But instead, they were seeing quick, efficient moves that seemed almost too simple. Surely that can't be all, another soldier muttered, his voice low but audible in the quiet room. Where's the real technique? Harris picked up on the comment, his grin widening. Oh, trust me, there's more, but the basics are what keep you alive. The rest is just decoration. Drax stepped forward again, his brows furrowing. Our training emphasizes strength, endurance, and overwhelming force. We crush our enemies with superior firepower and physical might. How does this, he waved a hand toward Harris, help in a real battle? Harris tilted his head as if genuinely considering the question. Your strength is impressive, he admitted. But what happens when someone faster, smarter, and more experienced gets inside your guard? All the strength in the universe won't save you if you can't adapt. The Galvan soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They had always prided themselves on their brute force approach to warfare, and the idea that it might not be enough was unsettling. Drax's eyes narrowed. Prove it. Harris raised an eyebrow. You sure? I'm sure. Without another word, Drax lunged forward, all 4 of his arms reaching out to grab Harris. To the Galvan's credit, his movements were quick, faster than the human had anticipated. But Harris didn't panic. He sidestepped just as Drax's arms closed in, his hand flicking out in a blur of motion. Before Drax could react, Harris had hooked one of the Galvan's arms and twisted it in such a way that Drax was suddenly on his knees, his upper 2 arms pinned awkwardly behind him. Harris barely seemed to be exerting any effort, but the strain on Drax's face told the story. The other soldiers watched in stunned silence. Like I said, Harris muttered, releasing Drax, who staggered back to his feet. It's all about leverage and pressure points. Strength doesn't matter if you know where to strike. Drax stood, rubbing his arm with a scowl. He had never been bested so quickly before, and the humiliation stung. This is unorthodox, he muttered, trying to salvage his pride. Unorthodox is what keeps you alive, Harris replied, his voice calm. The galaxy doesn't fight fair. Why should you? The Galvan soldiers looked to Drax for guidance, their leader's authority on the line. Drax, his mind racing, knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. All right, human, he growled. You've shown us your tricks, but what if the enemy isn't playing along? What if they don't care about your pressure points or leverage? What if they're just trying to tear you apart? Harris gave a small, almost lazy shrug. Then you let them try, and you make sure they regret it. Drax snorted in disbelief, but Harris seemed unfazed. You think all I know is how to twist arms and pin people down? You're missing the point, Commander. This isn't about showing off. It's about surviving. He paused, looking each alley and in the eye. Do you know how many times my species has been underestimated in the past? The room was silent. The Galvan soldiers knew the reputation of humanity, but hearing it directly from a Deathworlder was a different experience. People think they can overpower us, outsmart us, outlast us, Harris continued. They always do, and they always lose. Drax opened his mouth to respond, but Harris cut him off. I've faced bigger opponents, stronger ones, enemies who thought their brute force would be enough. But what they didn't understand is that strength means nothing without control. And that's what we have. Control. The soldiers seemed to be processing this, their initial disbelief slowly giving way to a reluctant understanding. Drax remained skeptical, but there was no denying what he had seen. Harris, with his seemingly effortless moves, had demonstrated a level of efficiency that the Galvans hadn't expected. We've seen enough for today, Drax said finally, his voice gruff. We'll continue tomorrow. As the Galvan soldiers began to file out of the room, Harris watched them, his expression unreadable. He knew he had planted a seed of doubt in their minds, and he was curious to see how it would grow. Drax, trailing behind his men, glanced over his shoulder at Harris. We're not done. Human. Harris smiled faintly. We never are. The next day, the Galvan soldiers filed into the training hall. Their usual chatter was replaced by an uneasy silence. Their leader, Commander Drax, had been unusually quiet since yesterday's demonstration, and the others could sense the tension hanging in the air. No one wanted to admit it, but Harris had shaken their confidence. His effortless takedown of Drax was something none of them could forget. Harris was already there, leaning casually against the wall, his expression unreadable. He nodded as they entered, his eyes briefly locking with Drax's. The commander returned the look, his jaw tight, still processing the events from the previous day. Today was about redemption. Without any formalities, Drax took his place in the center of the room. His large frame seemed even more imposing today, the weight of his authority pressing on the room. Today will be different, he announced, his voice echoing off the walls. No more wrist grabs or pinning arms. Show us what you would do in a real fight, Deathworlder. Show us what happens when the enemy doesn't care about technique, when they come at you with everything they've got. Harris straightened up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You sure about that? Drax didn't respond with words. Instead, he motioned to one of the largest soldiers in the room, a beast of a Galvan named Kraz, who had never lost a fight in his life. Kraz stepped forward, his forearms flexing, claws twitching with anticipation. This is Kraz, Drax said, introducing the soldier with a nod. He's never been bested in combat, not once. He won't be holding back. Kraz let out a low growl, his many eyes fixed on Harris. We'll see if your fancy moves work when I'm coming for your throat, human. Harris rolled his shoulders, unfazed by the threat. All right, let's see what you've got. The soldiers backed up, creating a large circle around the two, eager to witness this confrontation. There was no subtlety in Kraz's movements. He charged at Harris with a roar, all four arms swinging in powerful arcs. It was a full-on assault, designed to overwhelm, to crush. Harris moved like water. As Kraz's first swing came crashing down, Harris sidestepped fluid and precise, his hands barely visible as they deflected the incoming blows. He didn't try to meet Kraz's strength head-on. That would have been foolish. Instead, he redirected the brute force, slipping through the onslaught with minimal effort, using Kraz's momentum against him. Kraz's frustration was evident as his attacks failed to connect. His swings became wilder, more aggressive, but that only played into Harris' hands. With each miss, Kraz left himself open, and Harris exploited every gap. In a flash, Harris hooked one of Kraz's arms, twisting it at just the right angle. Kraz let out a grunt as he stumbled forward, off balance, and Harris seized the opportunity. With a quick pivot, he swept Kraz's legs out from under him, sending the massive Galvan crashing to the ground. The room was dead silent. Harris stood over Kraz, who was struggling to get back up, and calmly reached down to help him to his feet. You all right? Kraz looked stunned, his pride clearly wounded, but he accepted the help. He stood, towering over Harris, but the look in his eyes had changed. There was no longer the arrogance of a soldier who thought he was unbeatable. Now, there was something else. Respect. Harris turned to the rest of the soldiers. You see what happened there? Kraz is strong, faster than most, and can take down just about anyone with brute force. But the thing is, power without precision is useless. He was so focused on trying to hit me that he didn't think about how I could use his own weight against him. Drax's expression darkened. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. He wasn't about to let Harris take control of the room again. Enough with the talk, Drax growled. This isn't about teaching us tricks. We need to know what you'd do if your life was on the line. If your enemy was trying to kill you, you can't dodge forever. Harris' eyes narrowed slightly. He could sense where this was going. You want me to show you what happens when things get real? Fine. But you're not going to like it. Drax crossed his arms, his face a mask of defiance. Try me. Harris motioned for Kraz to step aside, then faced Drax. You've been asking for this, so I'll give it to you straight. In a real fight, one where my life is on the line, I don't play around. I don't look for ways to prolong the fight or make it flashy. I end it as quickly as possible. Drax scoffed, not believing a word. You think you could end a fight with one of us that easily? Harris didn't answer with words. He stepped closer to Drax, closing the gap between them in an instant. Before Drax could react, Harris had slipped behind him, his arm locked around the commander's neck in a chokehold. Drax's eyes widened as he realized how fast Harris had moved, how easily he had been outmaneuvered. Harris didn't tighten the hold, but the message was clear. This is how it ends, Harris said quietly. One move, no wasted energy. No show. If I wanted to, you'd be out cold in 10 seconds. The other soldiers watched in stunned silence. Even Kraz, still recovering from his own defeat, looked on with a newfound understanding. This wasn't a game to Harris. When it came to real combat, he was lethal. Harris released Drax, stepping back to give him space. The commander stumbled slightly, rubbing his neck. His pride shattered. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Harris broke the silence. This isn't about who's stronger, he said. It's about who's smarter, who can adapt. If you're going to survive out there, you need to stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like survivors. The Galvan soldiers remained quiet, processing the lesson they hadn't been prepared for. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Drax stood still, rubbing his neck where Harris had held him just moments before. The other Galvan soldiers were motionless, their eyes wide, their belief in their own superiority crumbling before their eyes. Harris, still composed, glanced around at the group. He knew they had come expecting a spectacle, something to reinforce their beliefs that strength and overwhelming force would always prevail. Instead, they'd seen the opposite: subtlety, control, and precision. Harris wasn't trying to humiliate them. He had nothing to prove. Instead, he was teaching a lesson they desperately needed to learn. Harris nodded, his voice calm but firm. Good. Then we're done for today. But remember this, the galaxy doesn't care how strong you are. It doesn't care how many arms you've got, how fast you are, or how sharp your claws are. Out there, it's about who can adapt, who can think on their feet, and who can make the right move at the right time. If you can't do that, you're as good as dead. With that, Harris turned and walked out of the room, leaving the Galvans to reflect on what they'd just witnessed. For the first time, Drax didn't have a retort. He stood there in silence, his mind racing. Perhaps the Deathworlders weren't what he'd expected, but that made them even more dangerous. And maybe, just maybe, there was something to learn from them after all.